This talk is taken from chapter 2 from this book, the section on masochism. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the masochist assemblage, as Deleuze and Guattari write about it themselves. So one of the key points I want to make is that assemblages differ from one another at the level of form rather than content. So in other words, the focus on content is somewhat misleading. Really, we should be looking at the form. Indeed, it is perfectly possible for assemblages to have the same content and still be quite different from one another, which is effectively Deleuze's argument against the notion of sadomasochism. He says even if they have reciprocal content, they do not have a reciprocal form. We can take it further and say that other types of fiction, such as fantasy fiction and historical romances, so-called bodice rippers, to name only the most obvious, can also contain elements that are recognizably sadistic or masochistic in origin or influence, such as scenes of sexual violence or fetishistic costuming and so on. But that does not mean that they should be placed in the same category as either Sade or Masoch. Readers of fantasy fiction and historical romances will not necessarily enjoy reading Sade or Masoch, and they probably wouldn't even be interested in Sade or Masoch because their own tastes are elsewhere. If the content is ambiguous, as these examples suggest very strongly that it is, then one must look elsewhere for a properly differential diagnosis. And so this is yet another argument against the focus on content that one finds in new materialism. Deleuze's argument in his book Masochism and all his subsequent work is that those differences must be traced to the formal structure of the assemblage, its forms of content and its forms of expression. We need, he says, a genuinely formal, almost deductive psychoanalysis, which would attend first of all to the formal patterns underlying the processes viewed as formal elements of fictional art. The significance of this statement cannot be overestimated because it goes to the heart of Deleuze's project and of course Deleuze and Guattari's project. What he refers to here as an underlying formal pattern is what they would later call the abstract machine. When Deleuze reads Masoch, his goal is to uncover the architecture or the diagram of the real that is yet to come, which is what they refer to as the abstract machine, which is implicit in Masoch's work. So Deleuze approaches the work like a detective, asking at every turn whatever could have happened for desire to work in this way. Which is why it's really important to pay attention to the chapter on the novella in 1,000 Plateaus. It's a vastly underrated chapter, but it gives very important methodological clues. And Deleuze deduces the architecture of Masoch's abstract machine by focusing on 4 aspects of his work. Firstly, he focuses on the language, that is the way he uses language, very much in the manner of a literary critic. Secondly, he looks at the underpinning ontology. And thirdly, he looks for mechanisms or devices or what some people might refer to as apparatuses. And lastly, he looks at the notion of fantasy, thus engaging with psychoanalysis. And what he shows is that sadism and masochism are distinct realities, not only distinct from each other, but distinct from other realities as well, with their own constitutive rules. In other words, he refers to them as realities rather than as sexual practices or tastes. It is Masoch's style, his use of language, that really draws Deleuze's attention. He sees in it the makings of a great work of symptomatology, which he says is why Masoch's name is remembered today. He was the first to draw the diagram of the assemblage we now know as masochism. And it is worth adding here that Deleuze and Guattari say all abstract machines bear the name of their inventors, just as masochism does. And Masoch's work is interesting in something more than an empty exercise in softcore pornography, according to Deleuze, and he suggests that it should be called pornology, because it diagrams this new type of reality. Deleuze will later say that it isn't necessarily a good or better reality, but that's beside the point because it constitutes a new and distinctive way of being in the world. Now, although his first work on Masoch, the short book Masochism, Coldness and Cruelty, published in 1967, so 2 years before he actually met Guattari, remains largely psychoanalytic in its approach, it is evident he was already beginning to formulate his ideas in such a way that one can understand why he felt the need to invent, with Guattari's help, of course, the holy trinity of concepts familiar to us from his later work. The holy trinity of his concepts are the assemblage, the abstract machine, and the body without organs. His second and third installments on masochism, which he produced with Guattari, are to be found in the book on Kafka and A Thousand Plateaus, make no mention of psychoanalysis, except to say psychoanalysis got masochism all wrong. But they do not disavow any aspect of the first iteration of Deleuze's engagement with Masoch, which was decidedly psychoanalytic. This could be read in several ways, but in my view, it suggests two things. That Deleuze considered the first book to be sufficiently removed from traditional forms of psychoanalysis that he did not feel the need to disavow it, as he did with several of his other earlier publications, which he came to regard as being overly theological. And that there was enough in the first book that stood up, even if one were to ignore the psychoanalytic dimensions. Deleuze and Guattari's writing on masochism shows in outline form the development of their thought as an intervention into behavioral studies, which is how we should see the concept of the assemblage, culminating in what we today know variously as either assemblage theory or schizoanalysis, and in effect there is no difference between those two things. In the first installment, Masochism, one sees the abstract machine taking shape as the name that will be given to what might be thought of as the compulsive feeling that the masochist has that things need to be this way and not any other way. In the second and third installments, we see the concept of the body without organs integrated into the methodology. This is not, however, the only point of interest in Deleuze and Guattari's work on Masoch. It also highlights two key elements of their methodology that is often overlooked. Firstly, it is deductive. It isn't interested in surface phenomena. It wants to expose underlying patterns, which should not be confused with a notion of depth. And secondly, it is not materialist, if by that one means it gives priority to the material dimension of that which it encounters. On the contrary, Deleuze and Guattari are quite explicit that to their minds, the expressive dimension, or the territory, or the T factor, if you like, always comes first, because it is that which causes matter to matter. It is, I think, a misnomer to call Deleuze and Guattari new materialists. It would be more accurate and I think more useful to think of them as expressive materialists. It is the form of expression that gives shape to the form of content. And here I'm quoting, the enunciation or the form of expression precedes the statement or form of content, not as a function of the subject that would have produced it, but as a function of the assemblage that makes this into its first gear in order to connect to other gears. This proposition, which is drawn from Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka, is, I think, central to their work as a whole. This is why Deleuze says clinicians do not pay enough attention to the actual texts of Sade and Masoch, and overly hastily latch onto the material elements, the whips, the chains, and the giving and the receiving of pain, when the real crux of the matter is to be found elsewhere. We've been told so many times that sadism and masochism are to be found in the same person, as though they were simply erotic tastes that one varied with mood and personality type, and not abstract machines embedded in assemblages, that it feels as though we have to believe it. And this should make us suspicious, according to Deleuze. If something is only true, or rather only feels true, because it has been repeated like an advertisement, then the chances are that this is because it lacks proper philosophical foundation. And that is precisely what Deleuze wants to argue is the case with the concept of sadomasochism, which in his view is very poorly formed because it relies on several false assumptions about the nature of both sadism and masochism. The exclusive focus on the giving and receiving of pain by psychoanalysis as well as philosophy is the key problem for Deleuze. He likens it to a doctor treating a fever as though it were a definite symptom of a specific disease, which is something no doctor would do because fevers are common to a number of possible diseases. That, he says, is surely to proceed by abstraction. And here I'm quoting again. We are told that some individuals experience pleasure both in inflicting pain and suffering it. We are told, furthermore, that the person who enjoys inflicting pain experiences in his innermost being the link that exists between the pleasure and the pain. But the question is whether these facts are not mere abstractions, whether the pleasure-pain link is being extracted from the concrete formal conditions in which it arrives. End of quote. Now, this passage is important because, as Deleuze goes on to clarify, it shows that what he objects to philosophically in the various accounts of sadomasochism produced by psychoanalysis is the assumption that there is an underlying common substance which explains in advance all evolutions and transformations. In agreement with Marx's famous inversion of Hegel, Deleuze always advocates that analysis should proceed from the concrete to the abstract and not the other way around. But this does not mean one should thereby start with the material dimension as though it were a concrete given. Deleuze is fine with abstraction. Indeed, as he and Guattari say in A Thousand Plateaus, the only danger presented by processes of abstraction is when one is not abstract enough. But it must be arrived at by properly critical means and not presupposed, either objectively or subjectively. This has two critical implications that underpin the development of the concept of the assemblage. Firstly, desire is not an undifferentiated substance. And secondly, desire can only manifest in assemblages. Assemblages have in common the fact that they are all arrangements of desire, but this does not mean that desire is the same in every assemblage, nor does it mean that all assemblages arrange desire in the same way or that they all have the same components. Differentiating and evaluating the different forms of assemblage that one encounters is an essential task of the larger project Deleuze and Guattari refer to as schizoanalysis. All individual assemblages are formally different from one another. They are all arrangements of desire, to be sure, but as Deleuze insists is the case with masochism and sadism, they are not necessarily arranged in the same way. So Deleuze proposes that Sade and Masoch eroticize language itself. It isn't the content of the writing that is erotic, though doubtless some people may experience it that way. Rather, language itself has become an indispensable element in the writing and thus to both assemblages. As Deleuze puts it, everything must be stated, promised, and announced and carefully described before being accomplished in Sade's world. And Sade's libertines in 120 Days of Sodom, and you see this in Pasolini's version of it in Salo, derive their satisfaction not so much from the sexual acts they carry out as from the fact that they do so in accordance with the words of the storytellers. In this way, word becomes the law and the law itself is perverted. Similarly, Masoch's heroes go to great lengths to put in writing precisely what they expect and want of their chosen tormentors, and even go so far as to set it all out in contracts, so that their words will be followed to the letter. In contrast to Sade's libertine instructors, however, Masoch's heroes are educators and persuaders. They have to find, seduce, and train their tormentors. And if you've read Wanda, you realize that she was quite reluctant to take up the role. So while Masoch's language is spruced with imperatives as Sade's is, the wellspring of these instructions is something that one would never find in Sade, namely a consensual agreement between the parties as to their respective roles. In Sade, language is demonstrative. It signals the matchless power of the author and his many mouthpieces over their world. Sade's libertines are all immensely talkative. Indeed, many of them do nothing but talk, and they constantly expound theories about the way things are, which in their world is always identical to the way things should be. But as Deleuze points out, despite all their proselytizing, they are not interested in persuading anyone to see their way of seeing things. On the contrary, nothing would be more alien to the sadist than persuasion, because it would indicate that their outlook isn't as singular as they supposed. The sadist wants to demonstrate that reasoning itself is a form of violence, and that he is on the side of violence, however calm and logical he may be. The point of the exercise is to show that the demonstration is identical with violence. This is why obeying the commands of the storytellers is, paradoxically enough, a highly sadistic act. The libertine's demands are ruthlessly objective, mathematical even, taking into account neither the pleasure, potential or otherwise, of the torturer, nor the actual suffering of the victims, which is often considerable. Sade's heroes are apathetic. They are repelled by enthusiasm. They neither love what they do nor hate the ones they do it to. They do what they do coldly, without concern for consequences, good or bad, for themselves or for their victims, and take their pleasure from a deliberate negation of the ego. The acts of violence inflicted on the victims are a mere reflection of a higher form of violence to which the demonstration testifies, according to Deleuze. In this sense, it can perhaps be said that violence in Sade serves only to motivate the device, as the Russian formalist put it. It is necessary, but only in order to achieve the larger goal of revealing reason to be a form of violence too. The implication of this claim, which is important for our purposes here in terms of understanding the assemblage, is that the presence of violence directed at others is not by itself sufficient to define sadism. In other words, the material dimension does not define sadism, it's the expressive dimension. And one must say the same thing for Masoch. Violence directed at the self is not sufficient to define masochism. Deleuze's analyses of Masoch suggest that actual physical violence is secondary in his works, just as they are in Sade's. And this is evident, Deleuze suggests, in Masoch's use of language, which in contrast to Sade is educative, not demonstrative. And I'm quoting again, he says, "We are no longer in the presence of a torturer seizing upon a victim and enjoying her all the more because she is unconsenting and unpersuaded. We are instead dealing with a victim in search of a torturer. But the torturer must be made in the masochist's image of what a torturer should look like, and their desire must be subordinated to the desire of the so-called victim. This is why the apparently sadistic characters in Masoch should not be confused with Sade's own creations. They are rather the realization of a specific masochistic fantasy, and they are quite different from anything you would find in Sade. Wanda, for example, would be utterly out of place in Sade, just as Juliet would be utterly out of place in Masoch. Moreover, the sadism exhibited by the apparently sadistic characters in Masoch is of a very different nature to Sade's libertines. For one thing, they need to be coerced into acting sadistically and remain hesitant and doubtful throughout about their role, and even become resentful towards their victims. Whereas Sade's characters act as they do instinctively and without hesitation or restraint. By the same token, Sade's victims cannot be masochistic, not least because Sade's libertines would find that intolerable. Their pleasure must be absolute, and they could not stand the idea of their victims also obtaining pleasure. So according to Deleuze, Masoch's language is in fact dialectical. He works through transpositions and displacements. The tortured victim is in reality the master, and the tormenting torturer is in reality the victim. It is this reasoning which eroticizes dialectical reversals that tantalizes and defines the masochistic assemblage, not the accoutrement of the dungeon, much less the infliction of pain. Deleuze also says that Sade and Masoch differ at the level of ontology. Sade's work is underpinned by a twofold negation of both the negative as a partial process and what might be termed as pure negation as an absolute. The two forms of negation correspond to the distinction between two natures in Sade as elucidated by Klosowski. So-called secondary nature is pervaded by the negative, as Deleuze puts it. But since destruction is merely the reverse of creation and change, and disorder is another form of order, the negative process it entails is necessarily partial. And this brings no joy to the sadist because it is a cause, in fact, it is a cause of considerable disappointment because it compromises the absolute form of pleasure that he desires. He thus opposes secondary nature with a primary nature in which a pure form of negation reigns supreme, overriding the need to balance destruction and creation, disorder and order, and so on. And again, I'm quoting, pure negation needs no foundation and in fact is beyond all foundation, a primal delirium, an original and timeless chaos composed solely of wild and lacerating molecules, end of quote. This pure form of negation corresponds to Freud's death instinct, which cannot be given in psychic life. As such, it is a delusion, but as Deleuze says, it is a delusion of reason itself, by which he means it is a delusion that arises out of the internal logic of Sade's thought. The pure evil the libertine is able to conjure in his mind as an idea, as the product of his reason, is infinitely more potent to him than the sad and disappointing reality of what he can in fact achieve, as a matter of actual lived experience. That which cannot be experienced can only be demonstrated, hence the importance of language to Sade and the need for repetition, which Deleuze suggests has an accelerating or intensifying effect, multiplying both the victims and the monstrosities, which must consist of cruel actions as well as disgusting actions, as Sarlo reminds us all too vividly, is Sade's way of trying, but ultimately failing, to leap from the realm of secondary nature to that of original nature. By contrast, Masoch's work is defined by disavowal, which, as Deleuze points out, is in fact an entirely different operation to negation. It is an operation, and I'm quoting again, that consists neither in negating nor even destroying, but rather in radically contesting the validity of that which is. It suspends belief in and neutralizes the given in such a way that a new horizon opens up beyond the given and in place of it, end of quote. Sade rejects the given, but Masoch doesn't. Rather, he turns his back on it and follows his own path, all the while carrying with him the knowledge that the neutralized real persists. He believes what he wants to believe, not what his eyes tell him he must believe. And his belief is a shield against what he doesn't want to think about. The clearest example of disavowal is fetishism. The fetishized object is determined as the last object the child saw before becoming aware of castration. This is in psychoanalysis, obviously. And in other words, before learning that women do not have a penis. As such, the fetish isn't a symbol, it is rather a frozen image, like a photograph, to which one returns helplessly, obsessively, and so on, to exercise intrusive thoughts, unwelcome discoveries, and so on, that threaten to disrupt one's status quo. The fetish then is a point of departure, the beginning of a line of flight, representing the last point at which it was still possible to believe in something. Deleuze proposes that masochism needs to be understood in temporal terms. Formally speaking, masochism is a state of waiting. The masochist experiences waiting in its pure form, that is, waiting as a pure intensity. Pain is a necessary part of the masochistic assemblage, but it is not a source of pleasure. It is rather an effect. The masochist waits for pleasure as something that is bound to be late and expects pain as the condition that will finally ensure, both physically and morally, the advent of pleasure. Deleuze cautions us not to confuse the sequence of events, pain then pleasure, with causality. Pain, he argues, only acquires significance in relation to the forms of repetition which condition its use. Masochism, according to Deleuze, alters the normal function of repetition in Freud's notion of the pleasure principle. Instead of repetition being governed by the idea of re-experiencing a previously experienced pleasure, it runs wild and becomes independent of all previous pleasures and becomes an idea and an ideal for itself. Pleasure and repetition thereby exchange roles. Pleasures now follow repetition, and repetition precedes pleasure. Just as repetition is unchained from pleasure, so pleasure is unchained from repetition and is similarly enabled to become a pure idea and ideal. Well, if you've listened this far, thanks very much for listening. Please do add a like to the screen and, of course, subscribe to the channel. And most of all, please share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you very much.